instantly seizing central territory. This pawn advance opens diagonal lines for the queen and bishop. Initiating a flank asymmetry, this pawn thrust immediately carves out a strategic imbalance, setting the stage for a dynamic, often counterattacking game. Establishing central control and preparing development, this knight aims to exert pressure and support pawn advances. Asserting immediate central influence, this natural knight development both defends its pawn and prepares for active piece play, steering toward common Sicilian paths. Shattering central pawn tension, this thrust immediately opens lines and challenges black's solid formation. Challenging white's central pawn, black opens lines and prepares for counterplay, accepting a slight pawn deficit for active piece development. Centralizing your knight so aggressively immediately challenges black's pawn structure and opens lines for your pieces. Instantly challenging the knight on d4, this development prepares for a pawn advance that could seize central territory. Securing the central pawn structure and developing another minor piece, this move gracefully reinforces white's territorial claims. This solidifies black's central pawn structure, preparing to develop the king's bishop and contest the d5 square. An immediate pressure on the c7 square, threatening a disruptive knight fork, forces black to react defensively and potentially compromise their pawn structure or development. Instantly challenging the knight's forward thrust, this bishop deployment seeks to untangle black's position and potentially disrupt white's harmonious development by creating immediate pressure on the c3 knight. Fabricating an immediate spatial advantage, this pawn thrust aggressively confronts black's bishop, forcing a decision about its placement and potentially disrupting any nascent bishop-knight coordination. Exchanging the bishop here sacrifices pawn structure for a moment, potentially opening lines for your king later, but crucially disrupts white's knight placement and aims to weaken their central control by doubling their pawns. Regaining the knight, white reestablishes a symmetrical pawn structure, but the doubled c-pawns now present a permanent structural weakness, potentially hindering future central control and piece development on that wing. Opening the center with d5 creates immediate central tension and forces a decision for white, potentially liberating black's queenside pieces and aiming for active piece play. Opening up the d-file creates a decisive confrontation. White gains initiative, forcing black to clarify their pawn structure and defend against potential threats on the now active central column. This liberates white's pieces for dynamic action, aiming to exploit the open lines before black can adequately consolidate. The knight boldly reclaims central influence, instantly challenging white's pawn structure and opening lines of attack for black's queenside. Developing the bishop to d2 is a logical step, aiming to connect the rooks and prepare for castling kingside, while also defending the e4 pawn, which could become a target later. This move sets the stage for potential central pawn breaks or a more fluid piece deployment, subtly reinforcing white's structural integrity and readiness for the middle game. Shedding the bishop pair in this fashion instantly alters the pawn structure, forcing white to confront an isolated queen's pawn situation on d5. This maneuver, while momentarily creating a structural weakness, aims to open lines for your pieces and potentially activate the c-file. Consider the ensuing positional battle, as the game now hinges on how well you can exploit the central tension and your enhanced piece activity against white's more static setup. Reclaiming the piece immediately solidifies white's central pawn structure and prepares for rapid development, a crucial step in exploiting black's slightly fragmented pawn formation. The bishop on c3 now eyes the queenside and can potentially swing over to support a kingside attack or control important diagonals. This exchange, while seemingly simplifying, actually creates a dynamic advantage for white, as the active bishop takes a more commanding square than the knight previously held. Exchanging queens here might seem like a straightforward simplification, but it plunges you into an endgame where your queenside pawn structure becomes a significant concern, potentially creating weaknesses that white can exploit down the road. The king's defender is removed from the board, opening the d-file for immediate and decisive pressure. Intending to shore up the e5 square, black initiates a slow but deliberate pawn structure adjustment. Solidifying central control and creating a potential outpost on e5, This move also subtly aims to restrict black's kingside mobility, a common theme in these closed Sicilian structures. Black tidies up its development, preparing to connect the rooks and activate the king's bishop to a more useful diagonal, aiming to neutralize white's imposing d-pawn and open up lines for counterplay. Developing the bishop to c4 actively eyes black's kingside and creates potential pressure, simultaneously preparing to castle and connect the rooks. The king boldly ventures to the queenside, embracing a long-term structural vulnerability while seeking refuge and potential counterplay on the open queenside files. A daring gambit that sacrifices some pawn protection for active piece deployment and aims to disrupt white's centralized control. Safeguarding the king's security becomes paramount as white tucks their monarch away, an essential defensive maneuver given the open d-file and black's unleashed bishop on c8, poised to join the fray. This castling action aims to consolidate white's position, bringing the king to a potentially safer haven and connecting the rooks, preparing them for future activity along the now available open files. It's a crucial step towards fortifying the homeland before engaging in further offensive or defensive operations on the board. Relocating the king to the 7th rank aims to connect the rooks and prepare them for action, while also providing a slightly more secure outpost than the original square, though it still leaves it rather exposed. Repositioning the rook to the central file aims to solidify control over the open file and prepare for potential pawn advances on the queen side, while also potentially eyeing weaknesses around black's castled king. Reinforcing the e-file, Re8 aims to activate the rook and prepare for potential advances or exchanges on the central files, while also offering defensive support to the lightly defended kingside. Opening the f-file with the rook sets up potential pressure on the kingside and creates flexibility for future operations, but it also leaves the 7th rank somewhat exposed for the moment. Reuniting the bishop with its comrades on the queenside, this maneuver aims to improve its activity by potentially eyeing the c-file or offering support for a future queenside expansion, while simultaneously untangling the rook from its current awkward semi-protected position. The rook on g3 is now actively eyeing the g-file and applying pressure towards black's kingside, hinting at future attacking possibilities, or at least creating a mobile defensive barrier against any potential black incursions on that flank. Shifting the rook to the 7th rank fortifies the pawn chain and prepares to contest the open e-file, a crucial corridor for action moving forward. The rook galvanizes the queenside, aiming to establish dominance over the open e-file and potentially create attacking chances by doubling on the 3rd rank. A subtle maneuver aiming to unblock the d-file and activate the rook, though it does create a potential target on d6 for white's pieces. Opening the queenside flank offers a strategic foothold, aiming to establish a strong presence on the queenside and potentially disrupt black's king's safety later on. The knight's repositioning to d8 is a somewhat passive retreat, aiming to defend the weak pawn on e6 and potentially redeploy for future action, though it sacrifices tempo and central influence by moving away from the immediate fight. Expanding aggressively on the queenside, white aims to restrict black's pieces and potentially create a passed pawn, forcing a reaction before black can properly consolidate their rook on the d-file. Consolidating the rook onto the d-file, this maneuver aims to create a more imposing presence, potentially pressuring white's central pawn structure or offering support for future pawn advances down the queenside. Initiating a crucial pawn advance on the queenside, this bold thrust aims to disrupt black's cramped position and generate potential mating threats down the half-open files. A subtle effort to prevent white's active rook infiltration down the g-file, though it does slightly weaken the kingside pawn structure. The rook's redeployment to the g-file aims to pressure black's kingside pawn structure and potentially create a new attacking avenue, a subtle shift from the previous central maneuvering. It's a waiting game, observing how black will react to the repositioning of white's heavy pieces. Bolstering the queenside pawn structure against potential advances, this maneuver secures the b6 square, offering refuge for the knight and preparing for a more active role by the rook on the open d-file, while simultaneously preventing white's b5 push from gaining further space. Shifting the bishop to the flank aims to create pressure on the queenside pawns and potentially launch an attack along the b-file, while simultaneously defending the weak c5 square. Instantly, black injects activity into the rook-heavy position, challenging white's doubled pawns and eyeing the open d-file as a potential infiltration route, aiming to disrupt the coordination of white's pieces that are currently focused on controlling space. A vital regrouping effort emerges, repositioning the rook for potential pressure along the opened central files. The previous pawn push on the queenside aimed to create space and disrupt black's coordinated pieces, a strategy now finding its logical continuation with this rook's redeployment. Notice how the bishop pair for black is somewhat passive, lacking immediate attacking potential, which white is trying to exploit by consolidating their own pieces into more active roles. This move prepares to contest the e-file and potentially support a future advance of the g-pawn, aiming to crack open black's kingside defense. Consider the implications for the d-file as well. If black's rook on d4 vacates, white could seize it. Reclaiming the c6 square for the knight signals a desire to regroup and contest the open files, potentially preparing to activate the a7g1 diagonal. Unlocking the g-file for the rook presents an aggressive opportunity, aiming to exploit the potential weaknesses around black's king after its pawn advance. The knight's repositioning aims to create a stronger defensive screen for the king and potentially launch a counterattack on the queenside, leveraging the fianchettoed bishop's influence. A bold attempt to disrupt black's burgeoning activity, opening a path towards the kingside by sacrificing a pawn. Challenging the misplaced bishop, black forces a simplification that unravels white's aggressively placed pieces. This exchange, while sacrificing a pawn, aims to disrupt white's attacking setup and potentially create counterplay on the now open files. The immediate consequence is the release of the d-file for black's rook, offering a more active role. Unleashing a central pawn chain's potential, this capture opens a critical diagonal for the bishop, aiming to disrupt black's defensive structure and exploit the suddenly exposed d6 square. This is a desperate attempt to salvage the rook's position after a positional blunder. The piece is now awkwardly placed, disconnected from the defense of its own king and offering little to the queenside attack, effectively a passive bystander in a game that demands decisive action. The rook charges forward, aiming to pry open the kingside and exploit the doubled pawns. The monarch steers towards the action, seeking shelter and perhaps a pathway to regroup amidst the encroaching rooks. The bishop's capture on f6 sacrifices itself to forcibly open the g-file, directly threatening black's vulnerable king and creating a dangerous, cascading discovered attack. A bold maneuver, seizing the open file with purpose and challenging the compromised pawn structure, though it potentially leaves the king exposed to further threats along that newly acquired diagonal. Seizing the open file with the rook, white aims to exploit black's vulnerable kingside, creating immediate tactical threats and potential pawn weaknesses. A desperate attempt to reroute the bishop to a more active diagonal, seeking to create counterplay against white's potentially exposed king, though its journey is fraught with peril given the open files and white's material advantage. King hunting begins as the bishop charges forward, aiming to disrupt the black monarch's sanctuary, forcing a crucial decision that will reveal whether the king can hold its ground or if its defenders will crumble under relentless pressure, potentially opening pathways for devastating attacks. The king's trek towards the center now risks exposure, as the rooks are poised for a coordinated assault. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure aims to restrict black's knight, particularly preventing it from finding active squares on c5 or b4, while simultaneously preparing for potential pawn pushes. The rook galvanizes its position, preparing to harass the enemy king's sanctuary with newfound purpose. Solidifying your king's safety and preparing for a potential pawn push, this quiet maneuver shores up the kingside by creating a vital escape square. The king's exposed position after white's pawn push now becomes a primary target. This initiative seeks to exploit that vulnerability by bringing the monarch closer to the action, aiming to create new attacking vectors or force concessions. activating the rook from its passive pin on the g-file. This brings it into a more dynamic and flexible role, anticipating potential advances on the king side or supporting counterplay on the central files. Solidifying the rook's presence on the d-file, this maneuver seeks to neutralize the immediate pressure and prepare for potential counterplay, a crucial step given white's advancing pawns on the queen side. The rook's relocation to the second rank completes the pawn's capture, a necessary reaction to prevent an immediate checkmate threat, while simultaneously setting up a potential tactical sequence aimed at exploiting the weakened king's position. The rook's journey to d2 now aims to pressure white's rook and potentially create a passed pawn by advancing the queenside pawns, though black must be careful not to overextend and weaken their own king's safety. Instigating a dangerous pawn storm on the king side, the rook now eyes the vulnerable black monarch. The king's journey now enters a critical phase, venturing deep into enemy territory to hunt for remaining pawns, a bold gamble that could either yield decisive material gains or leave it dangerously exposed. The rook now advances, aiming to pierce the queenside darkness and isolate the black king further into the back ranks. Unleashing the bishop to e4, black aims to exploit the exposed white king by potentially creating a battery with the rook on d2. Gaining a vital tempo to solidify the pawn's advance up the board, offering a potential escape square for the monarch while simultaneously threatening to create a passed pawn. Grabbing the pawn with the king is a desperate attempt to salvage something from a losing position, but it sacrifices crucial tempo and opens up the monarch to further attacks. Unleashing the pawn storm, white intends to create a decisive passed pawn on the king side. Seizing the passed pawn allows black to create a dangerous connected front, forcing white's king into a more exposed position as the rooks become less active in its defense. The king's shield is shattered, a perilous path now beckons. Recognizing the impending danger to the black king, the rook immediately retreats to a defensive posture, seeking sanctuary along the 7th rank where it can support the pawn's advance while still offering some protection. Reactivating the rook on the 7th rank presents a new threat, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside after the pawn's structure became so distorted. This pawn push aims to create space for the king's escape route and potentially challenge the newly opened file, but it also weakens the pawn structure on the queen side considerably, leaving the b6 pawn isolated and vulnerable to future advances. The promotion threat looms large, forcing black to make difficult choices regarding their rook's safety. Snatching the bishop on h7 completely neglects the looming pawn on h6, creating a potent passed pawn that now races towards promotion, while white's king remains exposed and vulnerable in the center. The rook's capture of the pawn unwinds a knot of material, but the real prize is the opening of the h-file. This freshly created highway for white's remaining rook is now a direct threat against black's compromised king, forcing immediate defensive maneuvers rather than allowing any counterplay. The pawn's desperate push forward signifies a last-ditch effort to create counterplay, a flickering hope against the encroaching rook and pawn majority. Hoping to finally pin down that mobile black pawn before it becomes a serious threat, white aims to activate the rook to create a blockade and control the a-file, potentially forcing a trade or limiting black's options for advancing the passed pawn further down the board. Black's king, now exposed and a target on the open board, seeks shelter by retreating towards the queen side. This pawn push aims to create space for the king and potentially support a later advance of the adjacent pawn, seeking to activate its own monarch while simultaneously building a defensive wall.